There is a document sitting in an archive in Virginia right now that lists the name, the age, the food supply, and even the weapons of every single surviving colonist in an English colony, written in the winter of 1625. It is called the Muster. And if your last name appears in it, you do not need a DNA test. You do not need a subscription to a genealogy website. You do not need a family legend passed around at Thanksgiving dinner. You have an actual government record, 400 years old, that places your bloodline in America before the Salem witch trials, before the Boston Tea Party, before this land was ever called the United States. Most videos about old American families repeat the same handful of Mayflower facts and call it a day. I did not want to make that video. I went digging into the real archival record. Census documents, land grants, court filings, church registries. And what I found were surname clues that professional genealogists actually rely on, including several that almost nobody talks about. One of them involves a name that is now an NBA team, and that name did not even exist during the lifetime of the man it came from. Another one involves a legal loophole written into a racist Virginia law in 1924. A loophole that exists to protect the descendants of one specific woman. So if you have ever wondered whether your family name is quietly hiding 400 years of American history, stick around, because by the end of this video, you will know exactly what to look for and exactly where to go looking for it yourself, for free, without paying a single subscription fee to anyone. Before we get into specific names, hit that subscribe button right now, because I am going deep into forgotten American history like this every single week, and you do not want to miss the next one. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with that document I mentioned, because everything else in this video connects back to it. In 1624, King James I dissolved the Virginia Company and took direct control of the colony himself. He ordered his officials to conduct a house-by-house count of every person alive in the Virginia settlements. That count became known as the 1624-1625 muster, and it is the oldest surviving census taken anywhere in what is now the United States. Almost no passenger lists from 17th century ships have survived. Almost no other population records from that era exist at all, which means this muster is not just old, it is functionally the only comprehensive snapshot we have of who was actually living in English North America at that moment in time. The muster does not just list names either. It records ages. It records where each household was located. It records weapons, livestock, boats, and food supplies. It even records who had died in the devastating Native American attack of 1622. This document is searchable today through Virginia's genealogical archives, and if your surname shows up as the head of a household in that record, that is not folklore passed down by a great aunt. That is a government record older than Plymouth Colony's 10th anniversary. And buried inside that same document is a specific legal status that almost nobody outside of serious genealogy circles has ever heard of. It is called ancient planter, and it was a real legal classification, not a nickname. If your ancestor arrived in Virginia before 1616 and survived there for at least 3 years, they qualified. In 1618, the Virginia Company issued formal instructions rewarding these specific early arrivals with the very first private land grants ever issued in the English colonies. 100 acres each and tax-free. This was not really about honoring anyone. The company had gone broke and could not pay its investors in cash, so it paid them in land instead. There is an actual lineage society that exists today, the Order of Descendants of Ancient Planters, whose entire purpose is verifying people who can trace their family back to this exact pre-1616 group. If you have ever heard a family story about an ancestor who received land directly from the King's Company, this is almost certainly what that story is referring to, and it can be verified through real Virginia land patent records. This same system eventually evolved into something called the headright system, which became the main way ordinary people acquired land in Virginia for almost a century afterward. Anyone who paid for their own passage or paid for someone else's passage received 50 acres per person transported. This meant a single wealthy colonist who paid to bring over a shipload of servants could end up owning thousands of acres almost overnight, simply by filing the paperwork. If your family surname shows up attached to a large early land patent, it is worth checking whether that ancestor was the one who paid the passage or one of the servants whose crossing was paid for by someone else, because both situations show up in the same records, just in very different roles. Now, here's a fact that almost never makes it into surname research content, and honestly, it should be at the center of this conversation more than it is. Buried in that same 1624 muster is the record of a child named William Tucker, and he is the first documented birth of an African child in English North America. His parents, Isabel and Anthony, were African indentured servants living in the household of a colonist named Captain William Tucker. At the time this child was born, there were only 22 Africans recorded in the entire colony of Virginia. The child was given his parents' enslaver's surname. That single naming decision, attaching a colonist's family name onto an African family who had no say in the matter, is the actual documented origin point of a naming pattern that would go on to shape African American surnames for the next 240 years. If you are researching a black family with deep roots in Virginia, the Tucker line is one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented starting points that exists anywhere, verified in a real 1624 government record, not a guess. Now, let's talk about the ship everyone assumes is the whole story, because the actual numbers are much wilder than the popular version, and there is a warning buried inside them too. The Mayflower carried roughly 130 people total, 102 of them passengers. 5 of those passengers died during the crossing itself. 45 more did not survive the first brutal New England winter. And of everyone who did survive that winter, only 37 are actually known to have left documented descendants. Here's the part genealogists wish more people understood. DNA tests cannot identify a specific ship. They cannot identify a specific passenger. What they can show is general British Isles ancestry or general colonial American ancestry, and that is the limit. If a website or a distant cousin's online family tree claims a direct Mayflower connection, that claim is only as strong as the paperwork sitting behind it, and a shocking number of these trees contain the same copied errors that have been circulating for over a century. And even among the small number of surviving lines, all of today's known Mayflower descendants trace back to roughly 24 male passengers total. Names like Alden, Brewster, Standish, Howland, Cook, Warren, and Soule. If your surname is not on that fairly short list, that does not mean you have no Mayflower connection at all, because female lines and later intermarriage spread that ancestry across thousands of other family names over 4 centuries. But it does mean that a documented direct male line is far rarer than the number of people who claim one. The real proof standard actually comes from something most people have never heard of, called the Great Migration Study Project. This is an ongoing scholarly research effort that has been running since 1988, cataloging more than 5,000 documented Puritan immigrants who arrived in New England between 1620 and 1640. Every single entry is cross-checked against original passenger lists, land records, and town registers. If your surname appears there, not on some random public family tree, but inside that project's actual verified research, that is real, defensible proof. And here's the thing, it covers vastly more families and surnames than the Mayflower's passenger list ever could, because the Mayflower was just one ship out of an entire wave of migration that brought over 20,000 people to New England in that 20-year window alone. This next one genuinely surprised me the most out of everything I found while researching this video. If your family came through what was called New Netherland, which is now New York, New Jersey, or parts of Delaware, Your earliest American ancestor might not have even had a fixed surname at all. The Dutch settlers used something called a patronymic naming system. A man named Jan, whose father was named Dirk, would be called Jan Dirksen, which literally translates to Jan, son of Dirk. But Jan's own son would then get a completely different last name. Based on Jan's first name instead, the surname changed every single generation. It was not a family name in the way we think of one today. It was just a description of who your father happened to be. Here's the strangest specific example I came across. A Dutch colonist named Harman Jansen settled near what is now Albany, New York, in the 1670s. And according to historical research, he apparently never once used the surname Knickerbocker during his own entire lifetime. That name only evolved into its final spelling near the very end of his life, and mostly after his death, as his descendants gradually standardized it. That exact name went on to become the pen name Washington Irving used for his satirical history of New York. From there, it became a general nickname for New Yorkers themselves, and eventually it became the name of a professional basketball team that still plays today. A surname that meant absolutely nothing on its own, invented essentially by accident, that somehow ended up shaping New York City's identity for centuries. So if your last name is Dutch, and it ends in sen or se, or it starts with van or vander, that is very often a direct fossil of this exact naming system. And tracing that name back typically lands you before 1687, which is the year English colonial administrators finally forced permanent inherited surnames onto the Dutch population, ending the patronymic system for good. Before we keep going, if this kind of hidden American history is the sort of thing you enjoy, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me what surname you are researching or what part of the country your family has been rooted in the longest. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best research leads for future videos come directly from what you all share down there. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a great time, because we are only about halfway through, and the next few names on this list are even stranger than what we have already covered. Not every old American surname survived fully intact, and some of them were deliberately changed on purpose, which is its own kind of documented proof. Huguenots, who were French Protestant refugees fleeing religious persecution, began arriving in places like New Rochelle, New York, and Manikintown, Virginia, starting in the 1680s. Many of them anglicized their own names almost immediately after arriving, specifically to blend in and avoid discrimination. The clearest documented case involves Paul Revere. His father was a French Huguenot silversmith named Apollos Rivoire, and he changed his own surname to the English-sounding Revere, specifically in his own recorded words, so that, quote, the bumpkins could pronounce it, end quote. That same pattern shows up elsewhere too. Levasseur became Vassar, which is the same name behind Vassar College. Fawcett became Fawcett. So if your surname sounds English, but it has a slightly too tidy, slightly unusual quality to it, especially if your family has roots in South Carolina, Virginia, or New York's Hudson Valley, there is a real chance it was deliberately re-engineered by a Huguenot refugee ancestor sometime before 1700. There is an even lesser-known thread connected to this exact same era. In 1654, the very first documented Jewish arrivals in North America landed in New Amsterdam. They were refugees who had fled Portuguese religious persecution in Brazil. Their names were Spanish and Portuguese in origin, names like de Lucena, d'Andrada, de Costa, and Levy. That same community later went on to build the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, which still stands today as the oldest surviving synagogue building in the entire country. Sephardic surnames with a documented American presence stretching all the way back to 1654 are among the oldest continuously recorded family names anywhere in the country. and almost nobody ever brings this specific history up in these kinds of videos. And one more overlooked group before we get to the wildest fact in this entire video. A failed Swedish colony called New Sweden was established in 1638 along the Delaware River, and it lasted less than 20 years before collapsing entirely. But the Finnish settlers who came as part of that colony already knew how to build log cabins, a construction technique that would go on to define the entire American frontier for the next 2 centuries. So if you have Finnish or Swedish ancestry tracing back to Delaware or southeastern Pennsylvania, your family may quietly be responsible for one of the most iconic images in all of American history. And almost nobody who lives in a log cabin today has any idea that specific credit traces back to a tiny, failed 17th century Swedish colony. All right, last one, and honestly, it is the strangest piece of legal history I came across during this entire research process. Pocahontas's documented descendants run through her granddaughter Jane Rolfe, who married into the Bowling family, which later married into the Randolph family, 2 names that became the absolute backbone of Virginia's colonial aristocracy. Genealogists actually split her documented descendants into what they call red, white, and blue bowling lines, depending on which of 2 different wives a particular ancestor descended from. Only the red bowling line is Pocahontas's actual direct bloodline. Here's the part that sounds completely made up, but is not. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was one of the most extreme anti-miscegenation laws in all of American history. It legally defined anyone with any traceable non-white ancestry whatsoever as non-white under the law. But the act included one very specific carve-out, informally known as the Pocahontas Exception. This clause allowed people with 1/16 or less Native American ancestry to still be legally classified as white. And it was written specifically to avoid reclassifying Virginia's elite founding families, nearly all of whom publicly traced their lineage back to Pocahontas herself. Think about that for a second. A single 17th century marriage was still directly shaping American law and legal racial classification 3 full centuries later. So here's the actual takeaway from everything we just covered. A surname on its own does not prove anything by itself. What actually proves it is whether that surname shows up inside one of the real, independently verifiable records we talked about today. The 1624-1625 Virginia Muster, ancient planter land patents, the Great Migration Study Project's verified entries, colonial Dutch church and court records, Huguenot congregation registries, Sephardic synagogue records. All of these are searchable right now for free through sources like the Library of Virginia, Family Search, and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Skip the random online family tree with 300 unsourced links copied from someone else's guesswork. Go straight to the primary documents instead. If your name is in there, that is not a family legend anymore. That is a documented fact with 400 years of paper trail sitting directly behind it. If you made it this far, you clearly care about real history, not the watered-down version everyone else is putting out. So do 3 things for me right now. Drop your surname in the comments, and I will tell you which of these 7 groups is worth researching first. Hit that like button so this video actually reaches more people who would genuinely appreciate it. And subscribe, because I am covering forgotten American history exactly like this every single week. And trust me, some of the stories coming up are even wilder than what you just heard. And one last thought before you go. Every single surname we talked about today started as an ordinary name attached to an ordinary person who had no idea their choices, their forced migrations, or even their enslaver's whim would still be traceable 400 years later. That is what makes this kind of research feel different from a lot of history. It is not about kings and generals. It is about regular families whose names quietly survived war, disease, forced relocation, and total obscurity, just long enough to end up in a document somewhere, waiting for someone like you to go looking for it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.